And I can tell you right now, there are definitely going to be people who try to find loopholes or ways to get around this. That's always going to be the case in any industry or anything that goes on. And if you go to see a home with an agent and that agent does not ask you or require you to sign a buyer agency agreement prior to going into that home, you know one of two things. Either they are incompetent and they're not aware of the rule changes or things that are going on, or they're just blatantly choosing not to follow the rules. Either one of those situations, whether it's ignorance or just blatant disobedience or a blatant violation of the law, whatever it may be, you know that if they're willing to put their money or their license at risk to do that for you, what does that say about how they're going to act or behave once the deal is actually happening, right? If they're Welcome to the Home Goals Podcast, the ultimate guide for turning your home goals into a reality. I'm your host, Derek Thornton. Join us as we navigate the twists and turns of obtaining a home. We'll be offering expert tips, helping you avoid pitfalls, and ultimately championing your journey towards that cherished place to call home. In this week's episode, we will be talking about a massive change that is taking place in the real estate industry across the entire nation. When we think about all that's going on in the world right now, you know, we got a presidential election coming up. We got chaos in the stock markets. We got the Olympics going on. There's a lot of things taking people's attention at the moment, and many people may have forgotten or may not even know all that is taking place on the real estate side of things right now. And there's a big change coming up specifically on August 17th. That's the date when these changes will officially go into effect across the country. And so ahead of that, I wanted to take some time to explain to you all what these changes mean, how that impacts you as a buyer, as a seller, wherever you may be in the process. But ultimately, this podcast revolves around helping people achieve that goal of home ownership. And so this is going to have an impact in the way that process happens. So I want to make sure that you are aware of exactly what is coming down the pipe and some things that you may want to keep in mind. There's still a ton of things, details and situations that they're working out. There's problems that we will have that we don't even realize we're going to have yet, right? There's a lot of uncertainty at this point. There's a lot of things that will change, a lot of things that will stay the same. It just depends on where you are. And so I don't want you to freak out or to panic. We will figure this out. A lot of this, we understand how to go through it, but I do want to make sure that you're at least aware of what is taking place. So this all revolves really around the representation of buyers in a real estate transaction, how their agent or their representation gets paid, how that representation comes to be in the first place. All of that is revolving around that. And back in 2020, so about 4 years ago, that's when all of this started. There was a class action lawsuit based out of Missouri in which a group of people came together and sued the National Association of Realtors. And they sued them basically saying in so many words that they were accusing us or our people in our profession of price fixing and colluding and saying that we were all coming together and trying to fix these prices or fix our commissions and not come down on it at all, and basically hurting the consumer in the process because there was no way that we would come down on those. Now, obviously, having been in the business myself for a decade now, I have not known that to be the case at all. This is one of the most competitive industries that you will ever see. There are people, I'd say 80% or so of the people who get their real estate license are gone within the first 5 years. 70% are gone within the first year. This is a highly competitive industry, and there have been all types of business models out there. People can sell their homes themselves. People can negotiate with their realtor. Those options have always been out there, but apparently that isn't something that many people believe, and that's what brought this whole lawsuit into being in the first place. And so we all have our own feelings about how this all came to be, but the point of the matter is that we are now way past the point of trying to discuss or argue who's right, who's wrong, or how this all works. Now that this settlement has taken place almost 4 years later, and the terms of it have come to fruition, now we have to figure out, okay, how do things look in this new landscape with these changes that we're going to have to implement? The overall settlement was just a huge document in a bunch of legalese speak, and it basically boils down to two main changes that are going to take effect on this date. One of which is in regard to the way buyer representation or buyer agency works. So whenever whenever a buyer starts to look for a home, they could go out and look by themselves. That's a possibility or an option that they have, but you're usually going to be far more successful if you have agent representation, right? It makes it easier for you to view the homes. You have someone in your corner helping you to negotiate, consulting with you, helping you to figure out the pricing and everything. Buyer agents are a huge deal and provide tremendous value to a lot of the buyers out there. Buyer agency wasn't even into it. So realtors as a whole have been around for over 100 years, but buyer agency didn't really come into play until about 30 years ago, right? And so that was one of those things that came into play because a lot of buyers realized we didn't have any representation in the deal. We're at a disadvantage whenever we're going out to purchase homes, right? So buyer agency more recently came into the picture as far as real estate as a whole goes, and a lot of people would usually have an agent that wants to represent them. So the first major change is that now whenever an agent shows a home to a potential buyer, they must have a written agency agreement in place before they go show that home. So if you call someone up, if you've never even met that agent, or if you're just calling up someone random to go view a house or tour a home, they have to have some type of signed agreement in place. That agreement doesn't need to be for an extended period of time. It could just be for that day or for that particular house or anything else, but it does need to be in place, signed by that buyer before you enter that home. So that's a change that's going to be in effect. Now, for us in North Carolina, that's not a massive transition for us because we've already had buyer agency agreements in place for years. That's the only world I've ever known, right? For the whole time that I've been an agent, that's how it's always been, is that whenever I was helping someone write an offer or show them properties or anything, I needed to have that buyer agency agreement in place, signed, detailing how long it lasted, how I get paid. All of that was laid out very clearly in our forms. And so we're a little ahead of the game compared to some other states. There are some states that don't have those agreements or didn't have those situations kind of set up with their agency, and it's going to be a much more of an adjustment for them to get used to it. For us, we're relatively ahead of the game as far as how that whole process works out. One thing that will change for us is how quickly we get that agreement signed. So prior to this ruling, we were allowed to have verbal or oral buyer agency, in which you basically say, hey, we're agreeing to work together, but I'm not going to make you or ask you to sign anything officially until you're ready. Or maybe I might say, hey, we'll work together for a couple of weeks, see if we kind of connect. And then if we do, then we can make this official and sign it up, whatever. But now we have to make sure that we have that agreement signed immediately. And again, it can be for a shortened period of time, but it is something that does need to be signed prior to viewing homes. And so that is something that you as a buyer even need to recall or remember whenever you're going out and viewing properties. And I think for us as agents, it definitely benefits us because it keeps us from essentially working for free, right? We all have horror stories of times where we've driven people around and shown them a ton of houses only for them to, at the last second, decide to use somebody else or decide that they don't like us or anything like that. And then we've essentially wasted all that time. So it does help us as in essence, whatever, as realtors, make sure that we're not just out there showing houses to homes, showing homes to buyers because we're desperate for a sale or anything like that. And so in that aspect, it does help. But on the buyer side of things, this also helps make sure that you have a clear or a firm understanding of who represents whom. And I can tell you right now, there are definitely going to be people who try to find loopholes or ways to get around this. That's always going to be the case in any industry or anything that goes on. And if you go to see a home with an agent and that agent does not ask you or require you to sign a buyer agency agreement prior to going into that home, you know one of two things. Either they are incompetent and they're not aware of the rule changes or things that are going on, or they're just blatantly choosing not to follow the rules. Either one of those situations, whether it's ignorance or just blatant disobedience or blatant violation of the law, whatever it may be, you know that if they're willing to put their money or their license at risk to do that for you, what does that say about how they're going to act or behave once the deal is actually happening, right? If they're cavalier about their profession, right? Because we can definitely get in trouble. We can get fined. We can lose our license as a result if we're continuing to break these rules. They're going to have all these different things in place. And if they're that cavalier about following the rules and things when it comes to their license, what are they going to be like when it's time for them to help you in the midst of a transaction, right? You want someone who is going to make sure that you have a clear and firm understanding of what's going on. You have someone that's fighting for you in your corner, doing everything on the up and not trying to find loopholes or shady things that could end up causing you a tremendous amount of headache or heartache once you're in the transaction. And so, again, we're going to have people who are policing us as well, just like they would have, like a secret shoppers. I think when I was working retail, we would have secret shoppers check to see if we were doing things correctly. They're going to have the same thing or a similar thing in real estate, right? If we go to show a house and we show a property to a buyer, we may get a phone call and someone says, hey, we noticed you showed this house at 123 Main Street. Send us over the buyer agency agreement you have with that person. And if we can't do that, that's when the fines come in. That's when the violations and all the troubles. And so there's going to be a lot of that going on. But you as the buyer also need to make sure that your agents are doing everything correctly as well. So that's the first major change that happens or will happen as a result of this settlement. The second one, which is going to take a lot more adjustment and getting used to for us, is that they are now saying that we are no longer allowed to display the buyer agent's commission, or what is being offered for the buyer agent's commission, in the MLS, the multiple listing service. So all the agents, we typically, every time we have a listing or a home that we're selling, we will input it into our local MLS. It's kind of like a database that shows all the homes. Now, all the sites that you all are familiar with, the Zillows, the Realtor.com, all those different sites, they are all getting their data from our local MLS, right? So when we put it into our system, it feeds it to all those other sites out there so that you guys are aware of the home as well. And really what we're trying to do is just trying to make sure that home or that listing gets maximum exposure so we can sell it quickly, right? That's how the MLS works. And most of the time, whenever, like, let's say, so I have a listing that's on the market right now, and I have an agreement in place with the seller in which they're saying, hey, we will pay you a percentage of the purchase price. We both have negotiated and we agreed on a fee that I'm going to charge them. Say, hey, we will give you X amount at the closing table if you can help us sell our home. If the home closes successfully, this is your reward for helping us. Now, me as the agent, I know that there's no way in the world I can find, vet, and show the home to all the potential buyers that may or may not be out there. And even if I did find a buyer, the likelihood of them being okay with me representing them and the seller is not going to be high. They're usually going to want their own representation, right? And so what I will do to try to, again, maximize exposure and get the most people interested in that home is I will agree to take a portion of the commission that the seller is offering me, and I will offer that out to a buyer agent and say, hey, if you bring us a ready, willing, and able buyer and you represent them through the deal, you can have this portion of my commission that the seller is giving me at the closing table. And what we would do is we would typically take whatever that amount was that we were giving up of our commission, we would put that in the MLS. And so it was displayed out there for all to see. And the MLS was kind of a self-policing marketplace in the sense that if I put out an amount that I was offering to a buyer's agent, if let's say an agent that I didn't like or an agent that just made the deal a nightmare of a transaction for me, if they came along and brought that buyer, I still had to pay them. Even if I didn't like working with them or I didn't want to, I still had to because I put it in that MLS. We had very strict rules and regulations saying, hey, whatever you put in that MLS that is being offered to those buyer agents, you have to pay it when that closing happens, right? And so that was one way to kind of make sure that everybody was doing things correctly. And if I was showing houses to a buyer, and let's say they wanted to see 3 houses one day, I could very easily just go on the MLS, look to see what compensation is being offered for those buyers, and I could let the buyer know very quickly, hey, just so you know, this house and this house are offering compensation that would cover the fee that I'm charging you. This house is not offering the entire port. They may be offering a portion of what I would offer, so you would need to make up the difference. But I would very quickly be able to tell them that. Now that they're removing the compensation that's being offered off of the MLS, it's adding a layer of complexity to us being able to figure out what's being offered, right? So now if they ask to see 3 houses, I'm having to reach out to all 3 of those individual listing agents to see what they're offering on the seller at home and let them know beforehand. There are some agents that are great at communication. There's some that are terrible. And so in some cases, I may know immediately and be able to let that buyer know before we ever even set foot in that home, just so you know, they're not offering a compensation to me, or this one may be not offering the full compensation. We could very easily let them know. Now it's going to be a little more difficult. If I have trouble getting a hold of that agent or finding out, I may not know what they're offering, or if that's going to be a situation for the buyer to keep in mind. And so that's one of the other issues. Another thing that I personally am concerned about is there being, I guess, fair housing violations or situations going on in these this new world that we'll have, right? Because let's say, for example, there is an agent who is selling a home and they are agreeing to give out a certain amount to help pay for the buyer's agent. As of right now, there's nothing in place to safeguard or to stop an agent from giving different information to different agents, right? And so you could have one agent who calls and says, hey, are you offering a buyer agent's commission? And they say, oh, yeah, we're offering X amount. And then another agent calls and they go, I don't really like that agent, or, oh, I don't really know that agent, or they don't seem that experienced. And so if they call and ask me, I'll tell them I'm not offering anything, right? Now, granted, that's not something that is ethical, is not something that we would expect everyone to be doing, but it is much more of a possibility now that we can't just put the number out in the MLS and be held accountable for that number. Now we have to trust that the information that is being disseminated to all the different agents is going to be the same across the board. And you very well could run into situations where people are going to find out after the fact that an agent who told them there was no buyer agent compensation being offered told something different to another buyer and their agent. And that is those are the type of situations that lead the way for all types of fair housing complaints, right? Because what's to say that it wasn't associated or related to a fair housing right? It could be religious fair housing violations. It could be race. It could be familial status, right? There's one agent who's working with a family who calls me and asks about compensation. There's one agent who's representing a person who's single, and the homeowner says, oh, I want to sell to a nice family, right? Well, now you're discriminating against that single person. That's a fair housing violation, but we have no way of proving that because we can't see the numbers that are being displayed out there. And so it's a whole lot of different things that can happen as a result of this. And again, we're going to be figuring this out as we go along. And much of this is, as always, is going to be dictated by the market, right? So the first thing that a lot of people latched on to is they thought to themselves, okay, well, there's going to be some massive changes going on and people are just going to refuse to pay anything to the buyer's agent. That is always going to be dependent on the market, right? So a few years ago when the market was crazy hot and everything was going quickly like this, we were already seeing sellers and builders who were offering significantly less or not offering anything at all to a buyer's agent because they were like, I don't really need to offer that out there. I can say I'm not going to offer any of that and it's still going to sell just like that, right? But if it's a market where things are moving a little bit slower and that house is taking a little bit longer to sell, they may offer more than what they would typically offer to a buyer, right? So it's all of this stuff is going to be very much dictated on how things are looking in the market, right? How quickly homes are selling, that's always going to be the determining factor in how likely someone is to be paying it, right? Because at the end of the day, the wild thing about all this is that the buyer, even in the situations where the compensation is covered, the buyer is still contributing to the overall compensation, right? Because you figure the seller only gets the money from the proceeds of their sale if the buyer gives them those funds, right? And so that means that by default, both the seller and the buyer are contributing to the compensation that is being offered out there. So the main difference or the biggest question that we're asking in all of this is, okay, is the seller going to allow the buyer's compensation or the buyer agent's compensation to be baked into the purchase price of the home, or are they going to require that it be paid separately? Right? If they require that it's paid separately, that's going to be an added expense on a lot of people. And especially for first-time home buyers, that can make or break a deal, right? When you have to come up with the closing cost, the down payment, and now potentially having to pay even more out of pocket up front instead of just being able to bake it into the purchase price of the home, that can definitely cause all kinds of issues. And so, unfortunately, I feel like the overall spirit of this rule change or this law isn't going to have the intended outcome that they expected. But the important thing is that we will figure out a way to make it work. We'll figure out a way to help these people in these situations. If nothing else, if people weren't aware before, they will definitely be aware now of just how much value a buyer's agent can bring to the table. Not all agents are created equal, so I'm not going to sit up here and tell you that with every agent or every experience that anyone has ever had has always been a positive one, but I can tell you more times than not, a buyer agent is going to be a tremendous value to you when you're going through the process of purchasing that home. And so these are just things that you definitely want to keep in mind. Again, there will probably be changes or consequences or benefits that we're not even aware of right now because we're still figuring this out as we go along. But the important thing is that you want to make sure that you are at least aware of all that's going on, and I'll continue to keep you all updated with these changes. But again, August 17th is the big date that everything officially has to start and go into place. Our MLS was trying to get ahead of the game, and so on August 6th of this month, we actually went ahead and already started taking the compensation off of our MLS. And so we've already started to try to implement these practices and make sure that we can hit the ground running. And again, we'll continue to keep you all abreast of what's happening. But as always, if you ever have questions, I'm always here to be a resource for you. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you next week.